to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasury for the destruction of the Jews. And Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa, the capital city of Persia, for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king and make supplication to him and entreat him for her people. Hatshepsut went and told Esther what Mordecai had said, and then Esther spoke to Hatshepsut and gave him a message from Mordecai, saying, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes into the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. And when they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than any of the other Jews. For if you keep silence at a time such as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will go also fast as you do. And after that I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther ordered him. So ends the reading. And the second one comes from the Gospel of John in the 20th chapter. And I'm going to read, this is the resurrection story about another woman who found herself in a similar kind of sense of trouble as she waited outside an empty tomb, not knowing why it was empty or what was going on. This is a story about Mary, who also is prepared for a time just as this. Listen for God's word. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." And when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" And supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. So ends the reading. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, I want to start today's sermon with the same question that I started last week's sermon. How are you doing? How are you doing? I asked that this week because during the course of the week, the curses coming up from the basement in our house, where Bonnie has been teaching this week, says that something is going on with the start of distance learning in our schools. Now, Bonnie is a wonderful teacher and wonderful in so many ways, as many of you know so well. But if you wanted to staff your IT desk, you wouldn't choose Bonnie to do that. And so what I've actually learned is that I thought Bonnie just needed to learn all the IT stuff to help her, and so she could teach. But actually, in fact, what has happened is that she has become the IT desk for all her students. If there's one who's not having ability to get on, she has to kind of fix them. So she not only has to learn this for herself, but she has to learn it for others. And that's partly why those curses are coming up in our house from the basement. Now I've seen this from both sides of the screen, actually, because not only did I see Bonnie doing that down in the basement, but I also visited here in the Neighborhood Learning Center, where the kids are online participating as the students in this distance learning. And I know it's been going pretty well for many of them, but I also have to tell you, I witnessed a kindergartner just staring at the screen as if he was lost, not knowing what he's supposed to do, how he's supposed to process this, how he's supposed to participate. What is this looking at the screen, and what does that have to do with being with teachers and being with friends? I heard actually a story of one student who, instead of pressing the accept button, pushed the decline button, and then was completely wiped off the Loudoun County Public Schools roster. And then I've seen, how that was responded to with NLC staff helping that student to find a way of being found again, of teachers being connected to, of IT people being called, and the staff being on a wait for like 30 minutes on the phone until somebody would be able to take their call. I have to say, I encouraged the parents to, or tried to give word to the staff to tell the parents that they should call the principal, because that was a little bit of passive-aggressive stuff from what was going on in my basement. So that the principal, sorry, Mitch and Matt, for getting the principals involved in that kind of thing that the teachers and the IT people are having to field themselves. But I do know, yes, indeed, that many have been able to do really, really pretty well on the internet. But I also have a foreshadowing of what is to come, because I've heard my grandkids now 3 weeks into their school are saying, this just isn't the same as when I get together with my teachers and with my friends. And so as much as it's difficult to get over this stuff this week, in a few more weeks, everybody's going to be getting the sense of, is this really what we want to have? And it's a tough time. It's stressful. It's worrisome. And yes, patience, the topic of this sermon series, is something that is required, but I maybe should put it in different terms. It's dogged persistence that's the better ask. That's kind of what we need. The only thing I think that we can say positively about having to ramp up all this distance learning again, since have done it in the spring and now doing it again at the beginning of the school years, is that at least we're not in California or Oregon or Washington trying to do this with ash falling from an orange sky, the house smelling like you had an indoor campfire in there the night before. Actually, I've been studying patience and trying to get things to share with you in these sermons. And one of the things that I've learned about patience is that it's not just about waiting until the storm passes, being chill while things get better. Like, patience is just about filling in the gap, and then we'll get fine at the end when something like a vaccine or something happens. Actually, patience is for the moment of being in that troublesome time without a clear sense of what the hope is that's coming, but be able to have both of those things together, the trouble and the hope, the despair and the new day that we want to come, even death and life, being in place together so that that is the reality, both those things overlapping. You know, I know I'm not the only one who's a fan of J.K. Rowling and her Harry Potter series. I was thinking about some of the, not only stories of Harry Potter this week, but also some of the characters that are there that Rawlings, in her very imaginative way, shares with us, that is so not only entertaining, but just it just grabs your interest and your whole self to be involved with. But also, she has this great sense of teaching kind of moral, ethical, virtuous kinds of ways of life to those who are her readers in a wonderful way. And so I was thinking particularly of two different characters. For those of you who are familiar with Harry Potter, you'll know these immediately. The first, they're both winged creatures. The first that I was thinking of were the magical creatures called Thestrals. Kids, you know who the Thestrals are? You know what they're like? They're horses, almost like horses. They've got skin, but the skin shows their bones. They don't have a flesh that's on their faces that's filled out, but it's all hollowed, and they see actually with the hollows of their eyes rather than with real eyeballs. And there is kind of a skin-like film over their bodies, and they have these manes that are wiry hair. And if you ever rode a thestral with its wings flapping, you could hold on to its mane, but you better hold on with all your life, because they're just so powerful and can fly so fast. They can fly faster than the fastest broomstick, that they're hard to relate to in some ways. In fact, you don't see the Thestrals, as you know, until something happens to you. Actually, when students arrive at Hogwarts, they get picked up in carriages as they get off the train and are going into the great hall of the school, and they're carried, it looks like, by magical carriages because there's nothing in front of them. That is, until you've had an experience in your life that helps you see what the Thestrals are. If you've seen somebody die, then you can see the Thestrals and see who they are. Harry Potter has that experience when his friend Cedric Diggory is killed at the end of a school year in the middle of a contest by the evil Voldemort. Next year when he comes, he goes, "Where did these horses come from that are drawing the carriages?" Now he's been able to see the Thestrals. Another winged creature that's in the Harry Potter literature is Fawkes, Professor Dumbledore's phoenix firebird, who, like the Thestrals, can embody both death and life. Because at times of emergency, Fawkes will put himself as a sacrificial kind of animal to put himself in between the evil person and Harry, and will be killed in the process. But as we know about phoenixes, and this is Latin roots, it's the bird that once it's killed, out of the ashes it rises again. Both of these animals have that strange thing of living in this middle place between death and life, between trouble and hope, between that sense of despair and new beginnings that are longed for. And I think they really help us to understand something about what patience is. Esther is the embodiment in our Old Testament reading about patience, because Esther knows she's in trouble, knows her people is in trouble, and she's required not to just be passive and not to just wait for everything to be resolved. And patience isn't just waiting, but patience is active. She fasts, she prays with all her handmaids and with all the Jewish people to say, for 3 days, help me to have the right words to say to the king so that what is threatened us will go away. And for just such a time as this, she is able to speak And I think that was so important for us to hear that Esther speaks. But more than just Esther's example, then we get into the New Testament and we hear of the story of Mary Magdalene, who is at the tomb of Jesus on Easter morning. Now, she is there at the day of resurrection indeed, but she is not there. Jesus might be there. Jesus might be risen. Jesus might be alive and full of the new life that is promised. But Mary Magdalene is not there. Actually, she's probably captured in some kind of trauma that has been with her since Good Friday, when Jesus was brutally killed on the cross on Golgotha. And she is still going over that trauma in her mind. Notice, and I don't know if you heard this when I read the text, she sees Jesus and the angels in the empty tomb, but through the veil of her tears so that she doesn't see. He comes to her, and she talks to him. She hears his voice, but she doesn't recognize that it's his voice and mistakes him for a gardener. In some ways, all her senses are operating as they should, but none of them are able to pick it up. I guess he doesn't want her to hold her after she does recognize that it's him. He doesn't want the touch until he's ascended. But I would imagine maybe even in some ways she could smell the sense of his presence if she had the sense to recognize his scent, that she could almost taste his breath that is there, that same breath that earlier blew the Spirit upon all the disciples, saying, "Receive the Holy Spirit." That none of her senses were able to operate in the way they're supposed to until what? Until he says to her, "Mary," and names her by name. I think that's so instructive to us about what it is to have patience in these times. You know, if you want to learn about trauma, one of the things I've learned is that people who are in trauma are like people in a lifeboat. Like, let's say they're on the Titanic and their ship is sinking from the Titanic, and they all, or at least some of them, are able to get into lifeboats and are floating in the sea as they see the ship, the mighty ship, go down. And what do when they're in the lifeboat? They cling to each other. They shut out the outside world. I think even in the movie Titanic, wasn't it possible for the hero to be taken into the boat? But for some reason, the panic was so great that anybody who was in the boat clinging to one another repelled anybody trying to get into the boat because they're so afraid. They're just so stuck. If there's an oar on the lifeboat, they're not looking for it. If there's a flare gun for them to shoot up in the sky so that they can be signaled, they're not looking for it. If there's a radio, a shortwave radio that might be used to call to help, they haven't looked at it because they're clinging to one another. That's what trauma is, being stuck in that. But when Jesus says to Mary, "Mary," her sense of being stuck within is broken by this voice that calls her by name, so that her attentiveness is turned towards the voice to see that the voice is from one who's paid attention to her. And it opens up the possibility of a relationship that's beyond the senses and more impactful than just what you see and what you hear. The relationship brings with it the possibility of witness, actually. Besides love, love is the ground of that witness. The relationship brings Mary to the ability to go and tell the other disciples, "He's alive. Jesus is alive. He is risen from the dead." That's the lesson I want to try to get across to us this morning. That the kind of active patience that we are called to doesn't seek to just escape the present, Even if there is deadly trouble and disheartening trouble in the present, it doesn't escape it. It says that somehow, the midst of that overlapping of death and life, there is in it that sense of being able to be active, resourceful, to make decisions, to do things, especially if we find ourselves able to do that in relation with one another. It isn't satisfied with being on hold, but grasps that the bad has happened and is mixed in nevertheless with the good, and not just a promised good that's far off, but a good that still is present, like the Holy Spirit is present to us as the gift of God. The Thestrals were the least likely candidates for beasts that you wanted to touch, much less trust. But when push came to shove in the war in Hogwarts, the Thestrals were there on the side of all those with Harry Potter and Professor Dumbledore and the rest, and they were wonderful friends and allies. And I wonder if there's something in that for us to say, maybe it's the strange one, the person we didn't think would be helpful, that actually is the person who can be helpful in our time of patience. Esther had that kind of courage where her patience was courageous, where she had a courage not to be stuck. And Mary Magdalene adds to that sense of the personal conviction, the personal connection that comes to her when she says, okay, Jesus, you're real. I see you. I can give myself to you. And in that very act of friendship and attentiveness, then also she is released to be active in her patience. So how are you? How are you? How are you doing with all these things? Well, maybe I hope that these stories would be something to help you when you go back into the basement and you have to be the IT specialist for your kids in schools. Or maybe if you're one of the staff from the Neighborhood Learning Center and you see that kid who is sitting in front of that screen going, what do I do with this? You help him know that he's not only that kindergarten who is that kind of image rather than a child, but no, actually he is a child of God, and that he's valued and loved. And that is the same kind of thing that we need to get across to that girl who was erased from the database, but nevertheless is beloved by God. I hope that these stories of that kind of love of God and the community by which we can convey that will help you to be patiently a witness in these troubled times. And that the fruit of this would be grown, that would be patience that prospers and blesses and gives fruit beyond. All right. We're having to be patient today with all the kinds of things going on. I hope that kind of